Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to this week dealing with the Progressive Era. Now, we only have two little presentations today, and only one of them has notes and a quiz that accompanies them, and that is the presentation we're doing right now. Now, my hope is that if you're on the hybrid plan, we will do this presentation together on Monday for groups A and C, or Tuesday for groups B and D. All right. And then later in the week, we're going to be taking our final assessment on all of this material. Okay. So last week, what we were talking about the problems of industrialization. We were talking about the working conditions were really bad. We were talking about monopolies taking advantage of consumers and customers. We were talking about the problems with segregation and with discrimination. Well, the progressive era is all about trying to fix those problems. Progressives wanted to reform society and fix the problems of industrialization. So we're going to use the acronym REFORM, okay? Reform, means to change, and it means really to change for the better. Okay, so what are some of the things that the progressives want to reform? Okay, well, here they are right here. These are all things that we've talked about, and then there's a couple of new ones that we're going to add to the list. Number one, this cartoon over here, this is monopolies. Okay, this is talking about monopolies. Monopolies are pictured as this monster. And of course, this is Lady Liberty right here, democracy right here. And monopolies are taking advantage. They're hurting democracy, they're hurting liberty. Here in the center, this guy, he represents corruption. Okay, he represents corruption on a couple of levels: corruption in business and corruption in the government as well. Of course, we got a picture here. This represents child labor. All right. Down here, we see the poverty of the slums. We talked about that when we talked about cities, all these people crowding in, and the need for good transportation, the need for good water sources, and water sources that were separate from sewer sources, and the need for better housing. Okay, all of that is kind of represented in that picture. And then the new one we're going to add to it right here, the meat packing industry. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so for each one of these, use the notes that I've given you and fill in the little worksheet, or you can take your own notes. All right. Now, there will be a couple of slides that I tell you this is all you need to copy down. Okay. So do pay attention as we move through here. But the first R in reform stands for rid problems created by industrialization. That's the whole deal with the progressive era here, is we want to fix these problems and rid society of them. Okay. Now, there were three goals. Well, before we get to the three goals, what are those problems? Well, it's the stuff we've talked about before: the dangerous and bad working conditions, the child labor, the long hours, the low wages, no benefits, no breaks, that sort of thing. Okay. Those are the problems that we associate with industrialization that we want to fix. So, how do progressives want to do that? They have three goals. All right. Number one, all right. And we've talked about this before in other situations. They want to give power back to the people. In fact, they want to take business out of the hands of owners and businesses out of the hands of corporations and things like that, and give more power of business to the people to control. Also, they realize that they need the government to help. Like, the government needs to help bust up trust. The government needs to help take care of safer conditions. So while we want to give power back to the people, we also want to give power to who represents the people, namely the government. We need the government to get involved, and we need the government to regulate business. And if we give more power to the people and we give more power to the government, then the hope is between those two, the problems of industrialization will be fixed. That's the final goal. Okay, so give more power to the people, get the government involved, and between those two things, the ultimate goal is to fix the problems of industrialization. Okay, so this is the first main goal: is to fix these problems of industrialization, give power to the people, get the government involved, and between those two things, we'll fix these problems of industrialization. Now, the E in reform, there have been a lot of corruption within the government, okay? And some of that corruption had come from business, all right, and business using its money. We looked at that cartoon, The Octopus, where monopolies and trusts were using their influence to influence government, okay, through money. So E stands for Election and political reform. Once again, it's about giving the people more power, okay, and getting the people to participate in government more. Now, this is all you need to write down for this letter. Okay, there's going to be some more things here, but I'm going to be honest with you. In this year of COVID, we are not going to get into this much detail. It is important to note that political reform will occur at all levels. It will occur at the local level, it'll occur at the state level, and it will occur at the national level. All right. And at one point in time, we had to list all these changes. But like I said, I'm not going to make you do that. So just get down this E here, election and political reform, give the people more power, and you'll be good. Okay. Now, the specific reforms that we used to talk about at the local level, it was going to be things like commissions and council managers. All right. We take it for granted now, but at one point in time, local issues were not handled by local government. A lot of it was handled by state governments, maybe even the national government. So when it comes to local government reform, get local people in positions of power and let them decide what to do. Like there was a major flood in Texas at one point in time. All right. Instead of having the state government or instead of having the national government involved, allow the people in the communities that were directly involved, allow them to help fix things. Okay. Elect them to commissions, elect them to councils, because they know the community, they know what's going on, they can fix the problem better. So with local reform, it's all about giving the local people more power. At the state level, all right, we have things like initiatives. People can propose laws. Again, we kind of take that for granted now, but people could actually say, I think this needs to be voted on. All right, this initiative needs to be voted on. Then they would have a referendum where they actually vote on the initiative. And if the state government was not living up to what it should do, okay, we can do a recall. The people can have an election redo. They can even vote to take officials out of office. So, once again, with these three things, we're seeing giving the people more power. The people to propose laws, the people can vote on the laws, and the people can recall the government if it's not doing what it's supposed to do at the state level. And then last but not least, national election reform. Things like primaries, all right? These are a big deal now, all right? Instead of having a bunch of candidates from a bunch of the same parties, okay? Instead of having a bunch of Democratic candidates, a bunch of Republican candidates, we're going to have a primary and we're going to narrow it down to one, all right? And then from this pool, then we will get our top candidate and they will represent the party. Okay, so primary elections, choosing representatives for the party. Something as commonplace today as secret ballot. We saw this in the picture last week of African Americans trying to vote. You had to go up to a table and you had boxes and you cast your vote in these boxes with people watching you. No, send them into a booth, have them draw a curtain, and have them vote without undue pressure. All right. And what's cool about that secret ballot is we will eventually see that happen in state elections and local elections as well. Okay. But it starts at the national level. And then the 17th Amendment, which grants us direct election to U.S. senators. The people get to choose the senators, not the governor, not the president, or anything like that. The people get to choose the senators for their respective states. Okay, so these are all government reforms at all levels. Again, it's about giving the people more power. F. F stands for filth and corruption exposed by muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists, and they were kind of sensationalist journalists. And their job was to expose problems in society that needed to be fixed. And the most famous example of this at the time is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Okay, now Upton Sinclair was an author. He went undercover in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And all these horrible stories came out of the meatpacking industry of basically food was not being protected. Rats and other vermin were scampering around the meat and defecating on the meat. Okay, they put out poison to catch the rats, but then the rats would die and the poison would be left out and the dead rats would be left out, and they would fall into the machines and they would get ground up into the meat. And all of this stuff is being sold to us, the unwary consumer. Teddy Roosevelt, who we're going to talk about in a second, President Teddy Roosevelt was a big meat eater. He read The Jungle and almost became a vegetarian. It is because of works like The Jungle and our desire to get the government involved in business more. We see two important pieces of legislation: the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Both of these are supposed to help workers because we want to keep workers safe. All right. But more importantly, they're supposed to help consumers as well because we want to keep the products safe. We want to make sure that rats and poison and stuff like that aren't getting mixed up in our food, aren't getting mixed up in the medicine that's being produced, and then sold to us, the unwary consumer, and making us sick and possibly killing us. Okay, so muckrakers help expose these problems and help bring about change that will benefit us as consumers and us as workers as well. The muckrakers are going to work hand in hand with the unions. Remember, unions are organizations that work for better working conditions, better pay, and better security for the jobs. Okay, unions help protect workers and consumers because it was the union that tipped people off or tipped St. Clair off about what was going on with the meat packing industry. Then Sinclair helps do his expose and writes The Jungle, and that brings the problem to a much wider audience. Okay, so unions are going to help protect workers and consumers as well. And let's just review those three big unions that we've talked about. One, the Knights of Labor by Terence Powderly, okay, which was an open union. As long as you had a job, it's the oldest union. You can join the Knights of Labor. The American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers. It's a closed union. You can only work at certain jobs to be a member of the American Federation of Labor. It is still around today. It's the AFL-CIO. It's joined with another big labor union, and they are still around today. And then you have the American Railway Union, founded by Eugene Debs. And remember, to work or to join the American Railway Union, you have to work for the railroad. Now, you can have any job working for the railroad, but you have to work for the railroad. The guys laying the tracks, the guys driving the engines, the guys helping load the baggage into the trains. As long as you work for the railroad, you can join the American Railway Union. But these labor unions are going to help work for better conditions, better pay, and better security for workers and consumers. We've already talked about the fact that we want to get the government involved to help protect us as consumers, to help protect us as workers. So the second R refers to reform makes it to the White House. Okay. Now, the other presentation this week is going to deal more specifically with reform making it to the White House. And we're going to talk about two progressive presidents. One is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt has a very, very important policy called the Square Deal. And in the lesson, you're going to see there are four parts to the Square Deal. It makes a square: conservation, protecting our natural resources; trust busting, getting rid of those monopolies; and then the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Those are going to be the last two sides to this new policy, the Square Deal. And again, it's all about change, and it's all about protecting us as consumers and protecting us as workers. After Roosevelt, okay, comes William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft becomes president next. All right. He is also a progressive president, but sadly, he often gets overlooked. He only served one term. All right. Roosevelt kind of handpicked him as his successor, but Taft did not have the same personality as Roosevelt. He actually is not as progressive as Roosevelt would like. So Roosevelt ends up running against him for the Republican nomination. Roosevelt loses. Roosevelt forms his own political party, the Bull Moose Party. And because of that, it splits the Republican vote. So our next big progressive president is Woodrow Wilson. Okay, he's a Democrat, and that's something I want to point out is you can be progressive and be both a Republican and a Democrat as long as you're about change and as long as you're about reform. You can be a progressive in both parties. Now, Wilson's plan is called New Freedom. And in the next presentation, you're going to see it forms a little triangle. Okay. And Wilson is really going to focus on economic reform, but he's going to continue Roosevelt's policies on busting up monopolies and busting up trusts. Okay. That's going to be a key component of his New Freedom program. All right. Between Roosevelt and Wilson, and even Taft to a lesser extent, as well as all the pressure that unions are putting on the issue, the pressure that consumers are putting on the issue, the pressure that workers are putting on the issue. The last letter in reform refers to monopolies end with antitrust laws. Okay, we finally get the government involved. There are two big antitrust laws. The first is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed during Roosevelt's administration. It outlaws monopolies and practices that limit trade. The Sherman Antitrust Act is later bolstered by the Clayton Antitrust Act, which also spells out specific activities that companies should not do and could not do. Okay, like that price fixing, raising prices when there's no competition, lowering them to drive out competition, that sort of thing. That's kind of protected under both acts. But also the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to protect labor unions as well, because we realize that labor unions help protect workers and consumers. Okay, and the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be associated with the Wilson administration. All right. So that's it for this lesson. Again, each letter is dealing with a specific problem with industrialization that we want to fix. We want to keep moving forward. We want to keep progressing. All right. We kind of talked about this with the lesson on women and African Americans. There are going to be efforts to try to end discrimination and segregation for those groups. Not going to be perfect, certainly going to have a lot of ground to make up, and it's going to take us a while to get there, but there are efforts at this time to end discrimination or to lessen discrimination and segregation when it comes to women and African Americans. So just a lot of change going on, and this desire to keep moving forward as we continue to grow industrially as a country. Be sure you review this material. You got a little quiz on this. Also, be sure you watch the little lesson on the presidents, okay? It goes into a little bit more detail about Roosevelt and Wilson. And we're gearing up for our final assessment here at the end of the week.